Tomorrow is World Mental Health Day, and there's going to be a range of content across the BBC to reflect that. And I think that one of the most encouraging things over recent years has been the willingness of people to talk about their mental health struggles. The pandemic, we've been talking about it earlier in the programme about some of the benefits that came out of it. It unfortunately also saw a rise in stress, and no doubt the current cost of living crisis will be having a similar effect on people. Professor Siobhan O'Neill is the mental health champion for Northern Ireland. Welcome to the programme. And we've spoken before, and as you know, I appreciate any chance to talk about mental health because I think it's such an important part of people's lives. And on this programme, there's been so much discussion about the worry that during the pandemic that it would lead to a tsunami of mental health problems. Has that been the case?
Good afternoon, Stephen. There certainly has been an increase, and I had never used the word tsunami, but that increase has been there. But it hasn't hit the levels that we might expect. I mean, the pandemic has led to a lot of anxiety and stress for people, but I think the mitigations that were introduced, the fact that we had a vaccine and, you know, we curbed the spread of the virus and we were able to put people on furlough schemes, which reduced the financial impact. All of those things together meant that, generally speaking, the levels of mental health in the population went back down to pre-pandemic levels. Fairly quickly. So that very natural and normal anxiety tended to go away once we got into the pattern and we knew what was going to happen and we were able to accept it a bit more. But there were certain groups who were really disadvantaged during that pandemic, and all the evidence is showing that those groups continue to suffer the adverse effects of the stress and trauma of the pandemic, and particularly children and young people, healthcare workers, people who had long COVID, and those who were hospitalised with COVID as well. You know, so we do have those groups, and there are carers and disabled people whose mental health levels haven't come back up again. So those are the groups that we're concerned about right now.
Because it's interesting that the pandemic was one of those rare shared experiences that everybody went through, but it's important to remember that not everybody experienced it the same way. And as you say, people can be quite resilient, and once things kind of settled and we knew what was happening, a lot of people were able to get back on their feet again and get moving. And I suppose even having that shared experience helps with your mental health. But there are many groups of people, as you've mentioned, who their experience of the pandemic was very different. And I wonder, for a lot of people, do they feel forgotten about?
Oh, they absolutely do feel forgotten about. People who are clinically extremely vulnerable do contact me with, you know, serious concerns about the possibility of another wave, continuing behaviours around trying to protect themselves and feeling that they've been forgotten about. And the focus now has shifted, I think, to the cost of living crisis and the cost of doing business crisis. You know, and those will bring mental health struggles for people as well. So in a sense, we've moved on. There's a war in Ukraine, you know, and there's a lot of other trauma and tragedy around at the minute. All of that stuff affects our mental health now too.
Because this is a situation where, on a sort of existential level, for want of a better term, you can look at this, look at the state of the world. You can look at what's happening internationally, and it's scary, it's intimidating, and it's uncertain. But then this cost of living crisis, the idea that you're going to have to struggle to keep the house warm, to put food on the table, that must be causing deep anxiety for so many people.
Yeah, and all the evidence shows that the rates of mental health problems are higher in the areas where there's more deprivation, and people who have financial struggles. It's a source of chronic stress, really, and that does lead to mental health problems over time. And all of the studies are showing that the rates of mental health problems are much higher in those more deprived areas. So we really need to look at that. And on World Suicide Prevention Day, I put out a letter to highlight the cost of living crisis and the risk of suicide, even in people who don't have a mental health problem, but who are plunged into this situation, the desperate situation where they feel that they have nowhere to turn, that they really can't talk about this stuff, and that the shame is too much. And then they engage in suicidal thoughts and maybe even suicidal behaviour there too.
Do you think that this needs to be addressed on a more fundamental level? Because I know that a lot of the messaging that's come out about the cost of living crisis is about how to save money, how to tighten the belt a little bit more. And if you go through the Sunday papers, there's so many features about money saving and things you can do to kind of pinch the pennies a little bit. That's all fine, but that doesn't take the pressure off people. That doesn't reflect the fact that this is, and for many people, it will be almost life or death.
Well, I mean, this is the thing. It's got to the stage for many families where there's no money left to save. There's no further savings that can be made. That's where people will be in a sense of destitution. So yes, it's good to talk about how we save money, and I think in terms of the environment, climate change, and all of that, we do need to look at being more sustainable. But I think for certain families, this is not about saving more. It's actually about the need to put money into people's pockets so that they can have an adequate standard of living, so that they can feel that they can have a good life and they can enjoy life. And that's where we are now for many families. So as mental health champion, I talk about mental health services and the need for self-care. But mental health is also a social justice issue. It's about the welfare payments that we give people. It's about how we treat other people in our society and how they're viewed.
Tell me about the role of mental health champion, because I'm always curious about this, that for people I know who are care workers who work in support, that it can be such a rewarding thing to do to help people, to make a difference to people's lives, but it can also be very challenging and very difficult as well. And I expect that for you, having to lead this, having to push this agenda forward, that it must be hard for you as well to deal with the sheer scale and depth of the problem that people face.
Well, I mean, it's challenging, but as you said, there's so much more focus and emphasis on mental health now that often you're pushing an open door in a sense. My role is funded throughout all of the government departments. I'm independent. I work closely with the Department of Health, but also with the Department of Education and Justice, and even communities and agriculture and those departments that you might think are less relevant to mental health. This role is an acknowledgement that mental health really is everyone's business. And that there's programs within all of those government departments that will impact on people's mental health, and lots we can do there. But I think some of the work that's happening in schools through the Department of Education, people know less about that, but that's really interesting that we now have lots of programs where we're trying to get in earlier and encourage young people to talk about their feelings and to develop those whole school approaches. So we're building in that resilience at an earlier stage and trying to catch this at an earlier stage so we can get people to the source of help. And then, of course, in the Department of Health, my first year was around that mental health strategy, that 10-year strategy. And now my job is sitting on all of the boards and committees to make sure that that strategy is delivered, it's delivered in full, and that we get the change that our system needs so that people can get help for their mental health problems at an earlier stage, and certainly at a stage before they get to the point of crisis.
I think that the nature of this problem, it's not something that can be truly ever solved. It seems like it's too complex for that. But do you feel that we're moving in the right direction? Because we've talked a lot of doom and gloom here about the problems people face. But I know from my own experiences of having struggles with mental health that the environment of talking about it, of getting help, seems so much more positive and so much more open than I previously would have expected it to be.
Yeah, I mean, we are talking about it a lot more, and there's lots more help available. I think what we need to understand is your mental health is really a product of the stress and trauma that happens in your life, particularly in those first few years of life. And those early attachments are really important as well, in shaping and helping your brain develop in such a way that you can manage a certain amount of stress and normal, natural stress. So those early years are really critical. And I think we're doing a lot more now to focus on those early attachments, to help parents at the early stages, and recognising that part of life is so important. But stress and trauma, sometimes it is inevitable, and so mental illness costs the economy $3.4 billion here every year in Northern Ireland, and we recognise that there's a certain amount of that is avoidable, and that's what we need to do. We need to be getting in early to get rid of that avoidable source of mental health problems, so that we can have a population who are able to work, who are able to be productive. That's one of the challenges I think that we have.
I'd like to bring the panel in here as well, David McCann and Alexa Moore. David, there's actually a story in the Sunday Mirror today, 1 million left with no mental health support.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually highlighting the fact that, Siobhan's just talked there, 3.4 billion cost in the Northern Ireland economy. It's actually 117 billion pounds across the entirety of the UK. And when you can just put that in context, that's actually more than the energy price cap is going to cost for 2 years. So that's just an example of just how much this issue costs the UK. And with this story, they're actually talking about basically 1.1 million people have gone a year without receiving any treatment on the health service. So the waiting lists are absolutely huge, and actually how we're getting treatment to people isn't totally working. And there is an appeal in the article here that basically we need to put more support and more resources in there. I know Siobhan's kind of talked a wee bit about that there in her interview with you, that we need a more overarching strategy to be able to cut these waiting lists and get people greater access.
Alexa, there's a story in the Mail on Sunday today that has the headline, "Bid to help those with the fear of Mondays." This is a UK Department of Health initiative launching a campaign to help people with the Sunday scaries, as they call it. People who, on a Sunday afternoon, that fear of work just builds up and builds up. And the study here is suggesting that around 5 o'clock p.m. on a Sunday is the worst time for it. Now, the tone is, it's slightly sniffy about all this. But as we've been talking, that kind of anxiety, regardless of what it's about, it can feel so huge to deal with for people. It can be such a problem and such a massive impact on their lives.
Absolutely. And I mean, as Siobhan has rightly outlined, so much of this is structural. It's about how we engage with our work, how we engage with, as young people, with school, with, kind of our social life and families. And so much of kind of mental health is kind of out of the individual's control, and I think that is a bit snooty from the Mail on the Sunday scaries. I've got a bit of them myself right now, but it is a real and valid fear, and we know that so many people struggle in their work right now, and so many people right now are working maybe 40 hours a week and aren't getting paid enough to keep up with the rising bills and rising rent, and all of that stress and anxiety really does build up. And I think that the role of mental health champion and the work that Siobhan's doing is absolutely really, really important. But David and Siobhan are right. We also need that kind of investment in services. We need to bring those waiting lists down, and we need to look at how we're actually treating and supporting people who struggle with their mental health. So many people, disabled people and people of colour and LGBT people struggle to access the services that are there because they're not necessarily culturally competent in terms of supporting those communities. So there is just a gamut of work that needs to be done in terms of supporting people with mental health. But as has been pointed out, it has benefits obviously for those individuals and for society as a whole, but also economically. It's a nice little bonus that if we start to address this properly, hopefully we can really make things better on a wider basis.
There's a story in the Sunday Express that really caught my eye, and it's Dennis the Menace says stress is the biggest menace today's youngsters face. The Beano character is spearheading a campaign to encourage children to talk about their mental health. Siobhan, it is one of those things that it's a huge problem. We've outlined that. But what would you like to see happening? And I suppose the question here is, what can happen being that there's no assembly at Stormont?
Well, I mean, what? There's a lot of things that need to happen, and not all of them require an assembly. The idea that people feel anxious on a Sunday afternoon, those feelings are data. We all need to recognise how we're feeling and start to think about what has caused that feeling, and if there's anything that we can do to start to modify that. And unfortunately, a lot, really high proportions of our population, they know we can talk about mental health, but don't talk about those feelings and don't connect. And then if they don't do that, it's very difficult there to problem solve. So that's the start of it there. The mental health strategy that I was talking about, that is progressing despite the fact that we don't have an executive. But remember, we're halfway through year one of the strategy, and the money that we need for that strategy, the 1.2 billion, which compared with the 3.4 billion annually, 1.2 billion over 10 years is a great bargain. But that money, a lot of it is needed towards towards the end of the strategy. So at the minute, next year we're going to need 24 million, and then there might be pressure on the Department of Health, which means that they need more money really to do this. And it's at that point an executive becomes crucial, because it will require decisions then to be made about expenditure across government departments. But at the minute there's lots of people working to deliver the strategy. There's a unit in the Department of Health, and they're progressing all of the actions, and we're doing quite well. But as I say, we're at the planning stage, we're at an early stage. It's about recruiting leads for the different actions. So I would be concerned going down the line, about that budget and how we're going to get that additional budget for future years for this strategy if there's no executive.
For anyone who's listening to this, who is feeling that pressure, who is feeling the struggle with everything that's going on, what are the resources available to help people at the moment?
Well, I think the first thing to do, if you feel that you're depressed or you're not getting any joy out of life, or you're anxious all the time and fight or flight stress response is going off a lot, it would be useful to go to your GP. And what they will do, and not many people really recognise this, is get a blood test done. Just check if all your hormones are in order, if everything is as it should be. Because sometimes there's actually something physical that's very simple that can be affecting how you feel and your behaviour. So get that done as well, and talk about this stuff, about how you're feeling, and maybe even keep a diary of your symptoms so that you have that information and that you can start to recognise any patterns between those feelings and things that are happening in your life. Look after your physical health is really important. The 4 pillars: try to eat good, nutritious, unprocessed food if you can. Get enough physical activity. It's a great antidepressant. And as we go into the winter, it can be more difficult to get out there, but that will make a difference. And try and get enough sleep, and make sure that you attend to your social connections, that you stay in contact with your loved ones, and that you have conversations about how you are with them. And then, if you're hitting the criteria for a mental health problem like depression and anxiety, and that's usually when these symptoms are going on for a few weeks or longer, then, treatments like counselling, or there's so many different types of therapies there, might be useful for you. So that's again when you would go to your GP, and many GP practices now have multidisciplinary teams which include mental health workers, and they'll be able to give you an appointment so that you can talk through everything and work out what the best solution for you is. But there's loads and loads of different options. Unfortunately, waiting lists can be quite long, but many employers have free counselling available. There's many communities that have counselling programs, and even in schools, right even down to the primary schools, have counselling programs now that were brought in as a result of the pandemic. So access your primary care practice and look after your physical health and get that sorted out as well. And that can make a big difference, and might mean that you don't need to go on antidepressants, or that you don't need that one-to-one therapy.
Professor Siobhan O'Neill, thank you so much for talking to me on the programme today. As I say, I relish any opportunity to talk this, because if there's just someone listening out there who's not feeling good, just to know that there are options out there, that there are people you can talk to, there are people that can help you, and you don't have to suffer on your own. So thank you for letting me speak about it as well. That's Professor Siobhan O'Neill, the mental health champion for Northern Ireland. And